Hello. The night of December 15, 1944 was frigid and impenetrable. Thick fog enveloped the Belgian Ardennes, concealing the snow-covered forests and fields beneath its shroud. A piercing cold gripped the forest, making the trees creak as if complaining about the bitter frost. Wild animals had long since taken refuge in their burrows, seeking shelter from the cold. The local population, who had not abandoned their homes and farms during this harsh wartime, huddled around fires, trying to keep warm. The front line seemed to have finally receded east, and the Belgians, Luxembourgers, and French, weary of war, sincerely believed that the worst trials were behind them and that a peaceful life was just around the corner. American soldiers from the few units of General Hodges' First Army and Patton's Third Army quartered there shared the warmth of the hearths with them. Most of the soldiers were resting, anticipating a swift return home. Only a few sentries stoically endured the cold and fought off sleep, guarding the peace of their comrades. Only the occasional V-1 flying bombs, streaking across the distant forest toward Brussels and Antwerp, disturbed the quiet. Their ominous whistling tore the soldiers from their half-slumber, reminding them that the war was not yet over. No one could have imagined that night the horror that would descend upon them with the dawn. Suddenly, without warning, a salvo from hundreds of guns ripped through the night's silence, heralding the beginning of the German offensive. The earth trembled under the tracks of dozens of tanks and armored vehicles, bearing crosses on their armor, moving like phantoms from east to west along the icy roads. Where the German forces could not immediately breach the American defenses, German paratroopers leaped from their vehicles and, sinking knee-deep, sometimes waist-deep, in the snow, attacked the strong points. The German soldiers of the 58th Panzer Corps and the 66th Army acted decisively and in concert, undoubtedly aided by the grim but invaluable experience gained in Russia. The Americans, lulled by the seeming calm, were completely unprepared for the sudden battle. Their forward positions came under heavy artillery fire, and SS troops, who had stealthily approached under cover of the morning fog, mercilessly gunned them down with submachine guns and grenades. Panic and confusion erupted. The plans and preparations of the sides. In the distant year of 1870, during the Franco-Prussian War, the German cavalry officer von Bredow led such a desperate and swift attack that it entered history and became one of the most revered legends of the German army, a symbol of courage and decisiveness. Perhaps the example of the brave cavalryman also inspired Adolf Hitler, who personally supervised the development and preparation of the operation codenamed Autumn Mist, Wacht am Rhein, which became the Wehrmacht's last major offensive operation on the Western Front. On December 16, 1944, 9 Panzer and 12 infantry divisions of the Wehrmacht, assembled for this desperate thrust, pierced the thin defensive lines of the unsuspecting Americans in the Belgian Ardennes and nearly inflicted a crushing defeat on the Anglo-American coalition. However, this success proved temporary, and by January 28, 1945, the Germans, exhausted by heavy fighting and having lost a large amount of equipment and manpower, were forced to retreat to their original lines. This was a remarkable episode of World War II in its own way, especially considering that none of the experienced German generals believed in the success of the task entrusted to them, considering it a gamble. But nevertheless, they all demonstrated high professionalism, unconditional loyalty to the Führer, incredible pressure in the offensive, and unprecedented tenacity in defense. By mid-December 1944, the Allies were fully convinced of the imminent end of the war. They believed that the German war machine was exhausted and that the acute shortage of fuel for tanks had finally forced the Germans to switch to positional warfare in the style of World War I. Although intelligence periodically reported strange movements of large German troop formations in the Ardennes region, no one in the Allied command was able to correctly assess this data and foresee such a dangerous counteroffensive, let alone the location where it would take place. Adolf Hitler undoubtedly dreamed of repeating his triumphant success of 1940, and with a swift breakthrough through the Ardennes, if successful, of course, eliminating the threat hanging over his Reich from the west, defeating the Allied armies, and turning the tide of the war in his favor. According to the plan, the 6th SS Panzer Army, under General Sepp Dietrich, was to advance on Liège and Antwerp. South of it, von Manteuffel's 5th Panzer Army was to target Namur and Brussels, and from the south, the 7th Army would secure its success by suppressing any Allied counterattack attempts from France. Field Marshal Walter Model, commander of Army Group B, was allocated all the reserves Hitler could muster by that time, up to 250,000 soldiers and 1,100 tanks, including the most modern Panthers and King Tigers. However, the troops assembled for the offensive were very heterogeneous in their composition and level of combat training. For example, the basis of the infantry divisions consisted of so-called Volksgrenadiers, conscripted only in 1944. These were either elderly men or youths barely 17 years old who lacked combat experience and professional training. Many of them fought, or tried to fight, bravely, but they clearly lacked skills and mastery. Even the elite paratrooper units, once considered the pride of the German army, no longer lived up to their former level. The constant losses during the war affected their combat effectiveness. Only the crews of the Panther and Tiger tanks, manned by experienced tank crews, were as good as ever. The tank officer and NCO Corps was mostly raised in a spirit of strict discipline and eagerly sought battle, ready to carry out any order of the Führer. In terms of their tactical and technical characteristics and combat capabilities, the aforementioned Tigers and Panthers individually surpassed any American Sherman or Grant tank, as well as the British Churchill or Cromwell. Fortunately for the Allies, Model had few such tanks. Recall that most of these predators, in the form of burnt-out hulls, dotted the space between the Dnieper, Vistula, Sava, and Danube, i.e., were destroyed by the Red Army on the Eastern Front. As for the Americans, in this seemingly quiet sector of the front, they had only a thin screen of 9 infantry regiments, or 27 battalions totaling 20,000 men, supported from the rear by just 1 armored division. Their very presence in this sector was entirely accidental. For instance, the 4th Infantry Division had been withdrawn to this sector after heavy fighting on the Siegfried Line for rest and replenishment. The 106th Infantry Division had recently arrived from the US and consisted mainly of poorly trained recruits with no real combat experience. They were essentially not interested in the opposing enemy and engaged in practically no reconnaissance, relying on data from the command. They had no anti-tank weapons as such, the approaches to their positions were not mined, and the radios, which would become vital for the survival and rescue of the soldiers in the following days, mostly lacked working batteries and spare parts. In contrast, the Germans had devoted much time to reconnaissance and had generally formed a correct picture of their opponent, his strengths and weaknesses. The beginning of hostilities, as retired General von Manteuffel writes in his memoirs. The first blow was surprisingly successful. However, we did not advance as far as planned, especially on the right flank. 5 divisions of the 6th SS Panzer Army were soon tied down by the enemy in heavy fighting with varying success in the Elsenborn, Krinkelt area. The leading formation of this army, the 1st SS Panzer Division, reached the town of Malmedy, but the town remained in American hands. The Germans' main focus was on road junctions, bridges, and communication centers. However, the towns of St. Vith and Houffalize held out for quite a long time, and Bastogne, where 6 roads converged, was never taken, becoming a symbol of the Ardennes battle. During the advance on Holsthum, the marching Volksgrenadiers unexpectedly turned off the road and headed towards a half-track armored personnel carrier on which a quadruple Browning anti-aircraft gun was mounted. Apparently, they mistook this APC for one of their own. The commander of the gun crew showed composure, let them get very close, and then mowed down the Nazis with four 12.5mm barrels. The platoon defending Waldhausen fought to the last and then called down fire on themselves, sacrificing themselves for the common victory. In the end, only one person from the platoon survived. 40 recruits from the 99th Division first abandoned a position and then reoccupied it, attacking the enemy with bayonets, which was generally a great rarity on the Western Front in 1944. At the Buchholz railway station, deep in the American rear, soldiers of the 1st Company of the 394th Regiment were queuing for their morning coffee, oatmeal, and bacon in the field kitchen. Suddenly, a column of German infantry marched directly at them out of the fog. Putting aside their bowls and mugs, the Americans grabbed their weapons and killed 75 attackers in the ensuing firefight. This unexpected resistance slowed the German advance in this sector. Despite these isolated, rather encouraging episodes, the American front was broken over a large area. Communication between units was disrupted. Many warehouses with accumulated fuel, food, and ammunition were looted by the advancing German paratroopers, while others were burned by their own quartermasters during a hasty retreat in jeeps to the rear so that valuable resources would not fall into enemy hands. This created additional difficulties for the American troops, depriving them of necessary supplies. The Führer's instinct did not fail him this time either. He chose the ideal moment for the attack, as the low cloud cover, constant fog, slush, and freezing temperatures prevented the Americans from getting their frontline aviation into the air for the entire first week. The Allied fighter bombers, Typhoons, Hurricanes, and Marauders, which could have provided substantial support to the ground troops, remained on the ground, helpless in these adverse weather conditions. This gave the Germans a significant advantage in the first days of the offensive. Operation Grief, one of the most unusual and daring elements of Hitler's plan of action in the Ardennes, was the operation codenamed Grief. It was led by Otto Skorzeny himself, the legendary saboteur number 1 of the Third Reich, famed for his audacious operations. The backbone of his 150th Panzer Brigade was made up of specially selected members of the German army who were fluent in English, preferably with an American accent. They underwent intensive training, studying American military uniforms, slang, habits, and customs. On the morning of December 16th, Skorzeny's sabotage groups, dressed in American uniforms and riding in captured jeeps and half-tracks, headed west into the rear of the American troops. The element of surprise was on the side of the saboteurs. By skillfully posing as American soldiers, they managed to capture several important bridges, communication centers, and warehouses intact, sowing panic and confusion in the ranks of the enemy. But they did not inflict much strategic damage. After 24 hours, all soldiers at the checkpoints were warned about the possible appearance of German saboteurs in American uniforms, and Skorzeny's men were blocked. Deciding that the saboteurs always had plenty of IDs and passes, the sentries at the checkpoints, on their own initiative, began to subject them to a peculiar test. While one soldier held the vehicle's occupants at gunpoint, another asked them specific questions about American culture, geography, and sports, which, in their opinion, only a real American could answer. For example, about the capital of Illinois. The correct answer is Springfield, not Chicago. Or about a city in the US named after a fruit. That's New York, the Big Apple. These questions, seemingly unrelated to the war, became a real test for the German saboteurs. But there were also more difficult questions. Thus, Lieutenant General Omar Bradley, commander of the 12th Army Group, almost became a victim of this improvised quiz, as he could not name the last husband of the famous film actress Betty Grable. This gap in the knowledge of the multi-star general seemed highly suspicious to the vigilant sergeant, and he decided that he was dealing with no less than an important spy, perhaps even Otto Skorzeny himself. General Bradley was saved from arrest only by the intervention of his adjutants, who confirmed his identity. Otherwise, he would have spent the rest of the day in some field dungeon. Goodbye. I was glad to see you on our channel. Don't forget to write comments, give likes, and subscribe to the channel. There are many more interesting stories ahead.